The cold night air of the carnival was thick with the sounds of laughter and music, but Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature as she wandered through the narrow, winding streets of the old town. The festive lights overhead cast long, twisting shadows on the cobblestones. The buildings loomed tall and close, their ancient facades seeming to watch her every move with silent judgment. She was new to the city, having moved here just weeks ago, and while she tried to immerse herself in the local culture, something about the place unsettled her. There was an air of history here, a weight that pressed down on her shoulders, making her feel like she was intruding on something long forgotten, but not forgiven. As Sarah turned a corner, she noticed a small, dimly lit shop that she hadn't seen before. The sign above the door was old and faded, the letters barely legible in the gloom. The display window was filled with a variety of masks, each one more grotesque than the last, their hollow eyes staring out at her with an almost lifelike intensity. Drawn by a mix of curiosity and unease, she pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges echoing through the quiet street. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust and decay, as if the shop had not been disturbed in years. The interior was cramped and cluttered, filled with shelves that seemed to groan under the weight of countless, strange, and forgotten objects. Masks lined the walls, hanging from hooks and stacked in piles, each one more disturbing than the next. Some were gaudy and colorful, others pale and skeletal, but all seemed to share a common thread of malevolence. In the dim light, their features appeared to shift and change, as if they were watching her, waiting for her to make a choice. At the far end of the shop, behind a counter covered in a thin layer of dust, sat an elderly man. His face as wrinkled and worn as the masks themselves. He watched her with dark, sunken eyes, a faint, almost imperceptible smile curling at the corners of his mouth. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as she approached the counter, her eyes drawn to a particular mask hanging on the wall behind him. It was unlike any of the others, simple yet intricate, with dark, swirling patterns etched into its surface. The mask seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, its hollow eyes beckoning her closer. "That one," the old man rasped, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "It's an old piece, very special. They say it was once owned by a woman who could see the future, but it brought her nothing but misery. Perhaps you would like to take a closer look." Without thinking, Sarah nodded, her eyes locked on the mask. The old man reached up with a gnarled hand and carefully took it down, placing it on the counter in front of her. As she reached out to touch it, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over her, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. The shop around her darkened, and the sound of the carnival outside faded to a distant murmur, replaced by a low rhythmic hum that seemed to come from the mask itself. She jerked her hand back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Don't be afraid," the old man whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's just the mask's way of introducing itself. It likes to get to know its new owner." Sarah forced herself to breathe, shaking off the strange sensation. Despite her instincts screaming at her to leave, she found herself pulling out her wallet. The old man's smile widened as he took her money, wrapping the mask in a piece of old yellowed cloth before handing it to her. As she stepped out of the shop, the door creaked shut behind her with a finality that sent another shiver down her spine. The street outside was strangely quiet now, the sounds of the carnival distant and muted. The lights seemed dimmer, the shadows longer, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced back at the shop, but the door was closed and the window dark. The unease she had felt earlier was now a gnawing dread, a sense that something had changed, that she had crossed a line she shouldn't have. Clutching the wrapped mask tightly, she hurried back to her apartment, the weight of her decision pressing down on her with every step. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. The mask had found its new owner, and the horrors that lay ahead were far beyond anything she could have imagined. Back in her apartment, Sarah carefully placed the wrapped mask on the coffee table, her hands trembling slightly as she unwrapped it. The dim light of her living room cast eerie shadows across the walls, giving the room an unfamiliar, almost sinister feel. As she unfolded the yellowed cloth, the mask emerged, its dark swirling patterns seeming to dance in the flickering light. The hollow eyes stared back at her, as if the mask was alive, waiting for something. A chill ran down her spine, and she quickly looked away, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been building since she left the shop. That night, sleep did not come easily. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with strange, disjointed images. She found herself back at the carnival, but it was different now, shrouded in darkness. The once lively streets were empty, the lights flickering on and off as if struggling to stay lit. She wandered through the deserted alleys, the only sound her own footsteps echoing eerily off the cobblestones. In the distance, she could hear faint whispers, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably ominous, filled with a sense of foreboding that made her heart race. As she walked, she noticed something strange. The mask, the one she had bought, was now in her hands. She didn't remember picking it up, yet there it was, its hollow eyes staring up at her. A feeling of dread washed over her, and she wanted to drop it, to rid herself of it, but her fingers wouldn't obey. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were coming from the mask itself. The air around her grew heavy, pressing in on her from all sides, making it difficult to breathe. She could feel her pulse quickening, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. Panic began to claw at her, and she started to run, her footsteps echoing louder and faster in the empty streets. The world around her seemed to warp and shift as she ran, the buildings twisting and bending in impossible ways. The carnival lights flickered and died, plunging everything into darkness. In the pitch-black void, the whispers turned into screams, high-pitched, agonized wails that reverberated through her skull. Sarah clutched the mask tightly, her only anchor in the overwhelming darkness. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. The screams stopped, the darkness receded, and she found herself standing in front of a large, ornate mirror. The reflection that stared back at her was not her own. It was a woman dressed in clothes from another era, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were sunken, dark circles marring her ghostly complexion. But the most disturbing detail was the mask. The woman in the mirror wore the same mask Sarah now held in her hands. But on her, it looked alive, pulsating with a dark, malevolent energy. The reflection's eyes, no, the mask's eyes, seemed to glow with an unnatural light, locking onto Sarah's gaze. She couldn't move, couldn't look away, as the reflection raised its hand and pointed directly at her. The motion slow and deliberate, filled with an unspoken accusation. Sarah woke with a start, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her heart pounded in her chest as she frantically looked around the room, trying to reorient herself. The nightmare had felt so real, so vivid, that it took her several moments to realize she was back in her apartment. The early morning light was beginning to filter through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. But something wasn't right. The mask was no longer on the coffee table where she had left it. It was on the floor, facing her, as if it had moved on its own during the night. Her blood ran cold. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that she must have knocked it over in her sleep. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. The mask seemed to be watching her, its hollow eyes following her every move. The whispers from the dream echoed faintly in her mind, a constant reminder that the nightmare might not have been a mere figment of her imagination. Sarah's unease grew with each passing moment, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Over the next few days, the disturbances only intensified. Objects around her apartment would inexplicably change places. A book she had left on the kitchen counter would be found on the living room sofa, or a picture frame that hung straight would be slightly askew, as if someone had touched it. At first, Sarah dismissed these occurrences as the result of her own forgetfulness, but soon they became impossible to ignore. One morning, she woke to find her bedroom door wide open, even though she distinctly remembered closing it the night before. The mask, which she had hidden away in a drawer, was now sitting on her nightstand, its hollow eyes staring directly at her as if it had been waiting for her to wake. The dreams continued, each one more disturbing than the last. The masked figure appeared in all of them, sometimes watching her from a distance, other times standing right behind her, its presence suffocating. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though she still couldn't make out the words. The line between her dreams and reality began to blur, and she found herself questioning her own sanity. Was the mask somehow responsible for these strange occurrences, or was her mind playing tricks on her? In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening, Sarah began researching the mask's history. She scoured old records, visited libraries, and even consulted a local historian. What she found only deepened the mystery. The mask had a long and dark history, passed down through generations, always leaving a trail of madness and despair in its wake. It was said to have been created by a forgotten cult, used in rituals meant to communicate with spirits from another realm. Those who wore the mask were said to be granted visions, but at a terrible cost. Each vision chipped away at their sanity until nothing remained but a hollow shell. As Sarah delved deeper into the mask's past, the disturbances in her apartment grew more aggressive. The whispers became voices, distinct and clear, calling her name in the dead of night. Objects would move violently, slamming doors, shattering glass, as if an unseen force was trying to make its presence known. The mask, once an inanimate object, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its patterns shifting subtly when she wasn't looking. The air in her apartment grew heavy, oppressive, as if the mask's dark energy was seeping into every corner, corrupting everything it touched. Sarah's paranoia reached new heights. She could no longer tell if the things she was experiencing were real or figments of her imagination. The mask's influence was everywhere, in her thoughts, her dreams, her reality. She became increasingly isolated, afraid to leave her apartment, afraid to stay. Every time she tried to rid herself of the mask, it reappeared, always watching, always waiting. The sense of dread that had first gripped her at the carnival now consumed her entirely, and she realized with growing horror that the mask was not just an object. It was a conduit, a gateway to something far darker and more terrifying than she could ever have imagined. As the days passed, Sarah's world grew smaller, her mind a labyrinth of fear and confusion. The once cozy apartment, her refuge from the bustling city, had become a prison, a place where shadows lurked in every corner, and silence was filled with the faint echoes of things she couldn't quite grasp. She started avoiding mirrors, fearing the reflection that might stare back at her. It wasn't just herself she feared seeing, but the masked figure that haunted her dreams, now a constant presence in her waking life. Every reflective surface seemed to hold a dark promise, an invitation to look deeper into an abyss she was terrified to acknowledge. Her interactions with others grew strained. Friends who called or visited noticed the change in her demeanor, the way her eyes darted around the room, as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows, the way she spoke in hushed, anxious tones. Sarah tried to explain, but how could she make them understand what she didn't fully grasp herself? How could she tell them about the mask, the voices, the growing certainty that something was terribly, inexplicably wrong? Their concerned looks only deepened her sense of isolation. They couldn't see what she saw. They couldn't feel the suffocating presence that had invaded her life. The mask's influence was insidious, creeping into every aspect of her existence. It was no longer just in her apartment. It was in her thoughts, her dreams, her very perception of reality. She would catch glimpses of it out of the corner of her eye, resting on her kitchen counter, or perched on the edge of her bed, only for it to vanish when she looked directly at it. Sometimes she would hear it, a faint rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was inescapable, relentless, and it was driving her to the brink of madness. Her nights were the worst. Sleep offered no escape, only deeper immersion into the nightmare that her life had become. The dreams were vivid, terrifyingly real, blending seamlessly with her waking moments until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The masked figure was always there, standing just out of reach, its hollow eyes boring into her soul. In one dream, she found herself in a vast empty landscape, a barren wasteland under a blood-red sky. The wind howled around her, carrying with it voices that whispered her name in tones of accusation and pity. The figure stood in the distance, beckoning her closer with slow, deliberate movements. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move, rooted to the spot by a terror so deep it felt like it was tearing her apart from the inside. When she awoke, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath, the fear didn't dissipate. It lingered, a constant weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. The mask was there, lying beside her on the pillow, its hollow eyes staring straight into hers. She screamed and flung it across the room, but even as it thudded against the wall, she knew it would return. It always did. Sarah's days became an endless cycle of dread and despair. She found herself drawn to the mask, despite the terror it invoked. She would sit for hours, just staring at it, her mind racing with questions and fears. The more she looked, the more the mask seemed to change. The swirling patterns on its surface shifted subtly, forming shapes and symbols that she couldn't quite decipher, but that filled her with a deep, primal fear. Sometimes she thought she saw faces in the patterns, distorted, screaming faces that vanished as soon as she tried to focus on them. Other times, she heard the whispers again, clearer now, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but that resonated with an ancient, malevolent power. Her isolation grew. She stopped answering calls, stopped responding to messages. The outside world felt distant, unreal, as if it existed behind a veil she could no longer penetrate. When she did venture out, she was plagued by the sense that she was being watched. Strangers on the street seemed to glance at her with knowing looks, their eyes following her as she passed. She became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, convinced that the mask's influence extended beyond her apartment into the very fabric of her life. She started avoiding certain places, the park where she used to jog, the cafe where she met friends. Everywhere she went, she saw reminders of the mask, felt its presence lurking just out of sight. Her paranoia reached a fever pitch when she discovered a series of photographs she didn't remember taking. They were of her apartment, each shot focusing on a different area of the room. At first, they seemed innocuous. Pictures of the kitchen, the living room, her bedroom, but as she flipped through them, her blood ran cold. In every photo, hidden in the shadows, was the faint outline of the mask. Sometimes it was just a blur in the corner of the frame, other times more distinct, its hollow eyes staring straight at the camera. She didn't remember taking these photos. She didn't remember ever seeing the mask in those places. Yet there it was, a constant, inescapable presence in her life. Desperate for answers, Sarah returned to the historian she had consulted earlier. But the meeting only deepened her fears. The historian, once friendly and open, now seemed distant, wary. He spoke in hushed tones, refusing to meet her eyes as he told her more about the mask's history. It had been passed down through generations, each owner meeting a grisly end. Some had gone mad, others had disappeared without a trace, and still others had died in mysterious, often violent circumstances. The mask, he said, was not just an object. It was a curse, a living thing that fed on the fear and despair of its wearer. As he spoke, Sarah felt the room closing in on her. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows deepening and shifting as if alive. She could barely hear the historian's words over the pounding of her own heart, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She knew, with a terrible certainty, that the mask was there, watching her, even now. When she finally left, she felt no relief, only a deepening sense of dread. The historian's last words echoed in her mind. Once you've touched the mask, it never lets you go. Back in her apartment, Sarah sat in the dark, the mask lying on the table in front of her. It was silent now, but she could feel its presence, a malevolent force that had wormed its way into her mind, her soul. She no longer knew what was real. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains filled her with a nameless terror, as if the mask was testing her, pushing her closer to the edge of madness. The final straw came one night when she awoke to find herself standing in front of the mirror, the mask in her hands. She didn't remember getting out of bed, didn't remember picking up the mask, yet there she was, staring at her reflection with wide, terrified eyes. The reflection grinned back at her, a twisted, mocking smile that didn't belong to her. She dropped the mask, screaming, and fled the room. But the damage was done. The mask had her now, body and soul. She could feel it inside her mind, whispering dark, incomprehensible things, filling her with a terror that defied reason. Sarah's descent into madness was complete. The mask had consumed her, leaving her a hollow shell, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The darkness within her had taken root, and there was no longer any distinction between the mask's influence and her own thoughts. The mask was her now, and she was the mask. Together, they would descend into the abyss, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Sarah's world had become a suffocating labyrinth of terror and confusion, and she was no longer certain where reality ended and nightmare began. Each day was a struggle to cling to the remnants of her sanity, as the mask's malevolent presence grew stronger, its influence seeping into every corner of her life. The boundaries between the waking world and her dreams had dissolved entirely, leaving her trapped in a state of perpetual dread, where every shadow seemed to hide unspeakable horrors, and every sound was a harbinger of impending doom. The mask, once a mere object, had become a living entity in her life, a sinister companion that refused to leave her side, no matter where she hid it, stuffed in a drawer, locked in a box, even buried deep in the closet. It would always reappear, placed conspicuously in the center of the room, its hollow eyes following her every move. The air around it felt charged with a dark energy, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to warp the space it occupied, making the room feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Sarah's heart would race whenever she saw it, a primal fear gripping her, but she was powerless to escape its gaze. The days bled into each other, a nightmarish blur where time lost all meaning. Sarah would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that someone, or something, was in the room with her. The darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and she would lie frozen in bed, straining to hear any movement, any whisper that might betray the presence of the mask's influence. But the silence was deafening, broken only by the faintest of sounds, an almost imperceptible breathing that wasn't hers, the creak of floorboards as if someone was shifting their weight, the soft rustle of fabric in the still air. Her paranoia deepened, feeding on itself like a ravenous beast. She started to see things, fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures just beyond the corner of her eye, faces peering out from behind doors that were never fully open. They were there one moment, gone the next, leaving her questioning her own sanity. The mask was always at the center of these visions, its presence an undeniable thread that connected them all. The masked figure from her dreams now appeared regularly in her waking life, standing silently in the corners of rooms, just out of reach, its gaze never leaving her. One evening, as she sat in her living room trying to distract herself with a book, she heard it again. The tapping. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of rain against a window. But there was something deliberate about it, something that set her nerves on edge. The sound grew louder, more insistent, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to echo through the walls. Sarah put the book down, her breath catching in her throat as she strained to locate the source of the noise. It was coming from the mask. It sat on the coffee table, exactly where she had left it. But now it was moving, ever so slightly, as if someone was tapping on its surface from the inside. She stared at it, frozen in place, as the tapping continued, growing faster and more erratic. The patterns on the mask's surface seemed to shift and writhe, forming shapes that twisted and coiled like living things. The hollow eyes, once empty, now glowed with a faint, malevolent light, casting eerie shadows across the room. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. A low, droning hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls, through her very bones, until it felt like her skull would split open from the pressure. Panic overtook her, and she fled to her bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her. But there was no escape. The hum followed her, resonating through the door, through the walls, until it seemed to seep into her very being. She could feel it inside her head, a relentless, throbbing force that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The mask's influence was everywhere, inescapable, and she knew with a sickening certainty that it was trying to break her, to bend her will until she was nothing more than a puppet, a vessel for whatever dark force resided within it. That night, she dreamed again. But this time the dream was different. It was sharper, more vivid, as if she was no longer just dreaming, but experiencing another reality. She was back at the carnival, but it was twisted and wrong, a grotesque parody of itself. The once colorful lights were now harsh and glaring, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to reach out for her like grasping claws. The music, once lively and joyful, had become a discordant cacophony, a jarring mix of sounds that grated on her nerves, filling her with a deep, primal fear. The masked figure was there, standing in the center of the chaos, its presence commanding, overpowering. Didn't move, but she could feel its eyes on her, its gaze piercing through her very soul. The crowd around her moved in slow motion, their faces distorted, their eyes empty voids that reflected nothing but darkness. As she tried to push through them, their bodies seemed to melt and reform, their limbs twisting in unnatural ways as they reached out to her, their fingers brushing against her skin with a cold, clammy touch that sent shivers down her spine. Sarah ran, her heart pounding in her chest, but no matter how fast she went, she couldn't escape the figure's gaze. It was always there, just ahead of her, waiting. The landscape around her warped and shifted, the ground beneath her feet becoming unstable, crumbling away into a yawning abyss that threatened to swallow her whole. She stumbled, fell, and the masked figure loomed over her, its presence suffocating, as if the very air around it had turned to poison. She could feel the darkness closing in, pressing against her, squeezing the life out of her as the figure reached out, its hand outstretched, beckoning her to join it in the void. When she awoke, it was still dark outside, the early hours of the morning, where everything felt heavy and surreal. The mask was on the pillow next to her, inches from her face, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She screamed, a raw, primal sound that tore through the silence, and shoved it off the bed. It hit the floor with a dull thud, but the sound echoed in her ears, louder than it should have been, reverberating through her skull like the tolling of a death knell. From that moment on, the mask's presence became even more overwhelming. It followed her everywhere, a dark specter that haunted her every waking moment. She could no longer think clearly, her mind a tangle of fear and confusion. The lines between reality and illusion had completely dissolved, and she was lost in a maze of her own making, with no way out. Every sound, every movement was a potential threat, every shadow a harbinger of the horrors that awaited her. The mask had broken her, reduced her to a trembling, paranoid shell of her former self, and she knew, deep down, that there was no escape. The darkness had claimed her, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed her completely. The final descent came one night when she awoke to find herself standing in front of the mirror, the mask once again in her hands. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. It was the masked figure, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the figure in the mirror raised its hand and pointed at her. The gesture slow and deliberate, filled with a terrifying sense of inevitability. She could feel the mask's power surging through her, pulling her towards the mirror, towards the figure that was both her and not her. The world around her faded away, leaving only the mirror and the mask and the overwhelming sense that this was her fate, that she had been chosen, marked by something far beyond her understanding, and that there was no escape. The terror that filled her was so intense, so all-consuming, that it left no room for thought, for reason. There was only the mask, the figure, and the abyss that awaited her. In that moment, Sarah realized the terrible truth. She had never stood a chance. From the moment she had touched the mask, her fate had been sealed. The darkness had claimed her, and there was no escape. The figure in the mirror stepped forward, reaching out to her with a hand that was both hers and not hers, and she felt herself drawn towards it, pulled into the void that was her new reality. The mask's power was absolute, its grip unbreakable, and as the darkness closed in around her, she knew she would never escape. This was her life now. A never-ending spiral into madness and despair, with no hope, no light, no end. Sarah's descent into madness had brought her to the edge of the abyss, but a part of her still clung to the hope that there might be a way out, a solution to the unbearable riddle that had taken over her life. She knew she had to uncover the truth behind the mask to understand its origins and purpose if she had any chance of breaking free from its grip. But every attempt to unravel the mystery only deepened her fear and confusion, drawing her further into the dark, tangled web that the mask had woven around her. The first clue came in the form of an old, tattered journal that she discovered while rummaging through her belongings. She didn't remember acquiring it, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers. The pages were filled with fragmented thoughts, incoherent ramblings, and sketches of the mask, its swirling patterns rendered in obsessive detail. Some pages were smeared with ink, as if written in a frenzy, while others were torn and crumpled, as if she had tried to destroy the words she had written but couldn't bring herself to finish the task. The entries hinted at a connection between the mask and an ancient cult, one that had long been forgotten by history but whose influence lingered in the shadows, waiting to be rediscovered. As she pored over the journal, Sarah began to piece together a narrative, though it was fragmented and filled with gaps that only added to her sense of unease. The mask, it seemed, was more than just an object. It was a conduit, a gateway to another realm, one where the boundaries between life and death, sanity and madness, were blurred beyond recognition. The cult that had created it believed that the mask could grant visions, glimpses into the past and future, but at a terrible cost. Each vision chipped away at the wearer's mind, eroding their sanity until nothing remained but a hollow shell, an empty vessel for whatever dark forces resided on the other side. The more she read, the more the mask's power seemed to seep into her consciousness, twisting her thoughts and warping her perception of reality. She started to see connections where there were none, patterns in the chaos that only deepened her paranoia. The journal spoke of rituals, of sacrifices made to appease the spirits that the mask called forth, and of the inevitable fate that awaited those who wore it. But the instructions were vague, the details lost to time, and Sarah found herself grasping at straws, desperate to make sense of the fragments of information that she had gathered. Her apartment, once a refuge, had become a maze of clues and riddles, each more maddening than the last. She found strange symbols carved into the woodwork, hidden beneath layers of paint and varnish, symbols that matched those on the mask. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a reminder that the mask's influence extended far beyond what she could see. Objects moved of their own accord, and she often found herself staring at a piece of furniture or a knickknack, convinced that it had been in a different place moments before. The walls themselves seemed to close in on her, the air growing thick and stifling, as if the very building was conspiring to trap her within its confines. Sarah's dreams became more vivid, more terrifying. She found herself in places she had never been, but that felt hauntingly familiar. Ancient temples buried deep in the earth, their walls lined with the same symbols that adorned the mask. Vast, empty landscapes where the sky burned with an unnatural light, and the wind carried whispers that spoke of things long forgotten. The masked figure was always there, watching her from a distance, its presence a constant reminder that she was never truly alone. The visions were disjointed, impossible to piece together, but they all pointed to the same conclusion. The mask was a key, a tool meant to open a door that should never be opened. One night she had a dream that felt different from the others, more real, more immediate. She was standing in a library, the air thick with the scent of old books and dust. The room was vast, its shelves towering over her, filled with ancient tomes bound in cracked leather and faded parchment. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate table, and on it lay an open book, its pages filled with symbols and diagrams that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. The mask was there too, resting on the table, its hollow eyes fixed on her. As she approached the table, the symbols on the page began to glow, pulsing in time with her heartbeat, and she felt a compulsion to reach out, to touch the mask and see what lay beyond. But before her hand could make contact, the room began to shake, the walls groaning as if under some immense pressure. The shelves toppled, books raining down around her, but she didn't move. Her gaze locked on the mask. The air grew thick with the smell of burning paper, and the light from the symbols grew brighter until it filled the room with a blinding, white-hot intensity. The ground beneath her feet crumbled, and she fell, tumbling into the void as the mask's eyes bore into her soul, filling her mind with a terrible, unspeakable knowledge. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, the taste of ash in her mouth. The mask was on the table in front of her, its presence a dark, oppressive weight that filled the room. The journal lay open beside it, the pages filled with new entries that she didn't remember writing. They spoke of a ritual, a way to sever the connection between the mask and its wearer. But the details were hazy, the instructions incomplete. She felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the realization that the ritual required a sacrifice, one that she wasn't sure she was willing to make. The days that followed were a blur of fear and desperation. Sarah tried to follow the instructions in the journal, but the more she tried, the more elusive the solution became. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift and change, mocking her efforts, and the mask's presence grew stronger, more insistent. The whispers in her mind became voices, distinct and clear, urging her to complete the ritual, to give in to the darkness and embrace her fate. She could feel the mask's influence burrowing deeper into her mind, eroding her will, her sense of self. In her desperation, she turned to the historian once more, hoping that he might have some insight, some piece of the puzzle that she had missed. But when she arrived at his office, she found it empty, the door ajar, the room in disarray. Papers were scattered across the floor, the desk overturned, as if there had been a struggle. And there, in the center of the room, lay the mask, its hollow eyes staring up at her with a cold, malevolent intent. She knew in that moment that the historian was gone, taken by the mask or driven mad by its influence. She was alone now, with no one left to help her, no one left to turn to. The riddle had become unbearable, a knot that tightened around her mind, choking her thoughts, her reason. The mask was everywhere, in everything, a constant, inescapable presence that gnawed at her sanity. She could feel it drawing her in, pulling her toward a final, terrible revelation, one that she wasn't sure she could survive. The lines between her thoughts and the mask's influence had blurred beyond recognition, and she could no longer tell where she ended and it began. The final clue came in the form of a vision, one that she knew wasn't a dream, but a memory, one that the mask had somehow implanted in her mind. She saw herself standing in a circle of candles, the mask in her hands, as she chanted words in a language she didn't understand. The air around her crackled with energy, and she could feel the mask's power surging through her, filling her with a dark, terrible strength. The ritual had begun, and there was no turning back. She knew what she had to do, but the price was more than she was willing to pay. As the vision faded, Sarah was left with a sense of dread so profound that it threatened to swallow her whole. The riddle had no solution, no escape. The mask's power was absolute, its grip on her unbreakable. The final piece of the puzzle was in place, and she was left with the unbearable truth. The only way to break free was to destroy the mask. but doing so would mean destroying herself as well. The mask and she were bound together, two halves of a dark, twisted whole, and there was no way to separate them without losing everything. In that moment, Sarah realized the full extent of her despair. The mask had won. It had taken everything from her, her mind, her sanity, her very soul, and there was nothing left to fight for. The riddle was unsolvable, the mystery impenetrable, and the darkness that had claimed her was eternal. The only question that remained was whether she had the strength to end it all, or whether she would let the mask consume her completely, leaving nothing but a hollow shell behind. The answer she knew would come soon enough, but the waiting, the knowing, was the worst torture of all. The darkness had consumed Sarah's life, but she knew that the final confrontation was inevitable. The mask's presence was now a constant weight on her mind, a parasite feeding on her fear and despair. She could feel it growing stronger with each passing day, tightening its grip on her soul. The whispers in her mind had become voices, distinct and clear, urging her to complete the ritual, to give in to the darkness that was now a part of her. The mask had shown her what she needed to do, and despite the overwhelming terror that it invoked, she knew there was no escape. She had reached the point of no return. The night of the ritual arrived and the air was thick with anticipation. Sarah had prepared everything meticulously, following the instructions laid out in the journal. Candles arranged in a perfect circle, symbols drawn in chalk on the floor, and the mask placed at the center of it all, its hollow eyes staring up at her with a malevolent hunger. The room was silent, the only sound her own breathing, shallow and uneven as she tried to steady herself for what was to come. The fear that gripped her was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a deep, primal terror that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. But she knew she had to see this through. There was no other choice. As she stood at the edge of the circle, the candles flickered, their flames casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The symbols on the floor seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their lines shifting and writhing, as if alive. Sarah could feel the mask's influence creeping into her mind, whispering dark promises of power and knowledge, a freedom from the torment that had plagued her for so long. But she knew better. The mask was a liar, a trickster, and its promises were nothing but a trap. To give in would be to lose herself completely, to become another victim in its long, bloody history. Taking a deep breath, she began to chant the words she had memorized from the journal, her voice trembling but steady. The air grew thick with tension, the energy in the room building as the ritual progressed. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow longer, darker, reaching out for her as if trying to pull her into the void. The voices in her mind grew louder, more insistent, urging her to stop, to turn back before it was too late. But she pressed on, her resolve hardening as the ritual reached its climax. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness as the candles were snuffed out all at once, leaving only the faint glow of the symbols on the floor to light the space. The air grew cold, so cold that Sarah could see her breath in the dim light, and the sense of dread that had been building inside her reached a fever pitch. She could feel the mask's power surging through her, a dark, oppressive force that threatened to tear her apart from the inside. The voices in her mind were screaming now, a cacophony of madness that drowned out her thoughts. Her very sense of self, she could feel her grip on reality slipping, her mind unraveling as the mask's influence took hold. And then, as if from the depths of a nightmare, the masked figure appeared before her. It emerged from the shadows, its form indistinct but undeniably real. It was tall, impossibly tall, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The mask it wore was identical to the one on the floor, but on this figure, it seemed alive, pulsating with a dark energy that made the very air around it tremble. Its hollow eyes bored into Sarah's soul, and she could feel its gaze pulling her in, dragging her deeper into the abyss. The figure did not speak, but its intentions were clear. It was here to claim her, to complete the ritual that had begun the moment she had touched the mask. Sarah could feel the darkness closing in around her, the walls of the room seeming to bend and twist as if the very fabric of reality was coming undone. The symbols on the floor glowed brighter, their light casting the figure in sharp relief, highlighting the intricate patterns that swirled across its surface. The figure reached out with a long, skeletal hand, beckoning her to join it in the circle. The fear that gripped Sarah was paralyzing, but deep down, she knew what she had to do. The journal had spoken of a sacrifice, a way to sever the bond between the mask and its wearer, but it had not specified the cost. She could feel the answer burning in her mind, the mask's influence trying to twist it, to make her believe that there was another way. But there wasn't. The only way to break free was to destroy the mask, to destroy herself. It was the final, terrible truth that the mask had hidden from her, the price of her freedom. With a scream of pure terror, Sarah lunged for the mask, her hands closing around it with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The moment her fingers touched its surface, the world around her exploded into chaos. The shadows on the walls erupted, writhing and twisting as if alive, and the air was filled with the sound of wailing voices, a chorus of despair that echoed through the room. The figure moved towards her, its skeletal hand reaching for her. But Sarah held fast, her mind focused on one thing: the destruction of the mask. She could feel the mask's power surging through her, a dark, malevolent force that tried to pull her into the void, to consume her soul, but she fought back with every ounce of strength she had left, her grip tightening on the mask as she chanted the final words of the ritual. The symbols on the floor flared with a blinding light, their energy coursing through her, filling her with a searing pain that tore at her very being. The figure recoiled, its form flickering as the light grew brighter, but it was too late. Sarah could feel the bond between her and the mask breaking, the dark threads that had bound them together unraveling, but the pain was unbearable. In that moment, she knew she was dying. The mask's power was too great, too deeply entwined with her soul. And as it began to shatter, she could feel her own life force slipping away. The room around her dissolved into a blur of light and shadow, the voices in her mind fading into silence. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the mask, its surface cracking and splintering, its hollow eyes staring back at her with an expression that could only be described as rage. And then everything went black. When Sarah awoke, she was lying on the floor of her apartment, the room bathed in the soft light of dawn. The mask was gone, its presence erased from the world, but the scars it had left on her soul remained. She could still feel the echoes of its power, the darkness that had consumed her. But it was distant now, a memory that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The ritual had worked. She was free, but at what cost? As she lay there, staring up at the ceiling, she couldn't help but wonder if she had truly escaped, or if the mask had simply moved on, waiting for its next victim. The fear that had gripped her for so long was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, and she knew that it would never truly leave her. The mask had taken everything from her, her sanity, her peace of mind, her very sense of self, and while she had survived, she was forever changed. The ritual was over, but the darkness remained, a shadow that would follow her for the rest of her days. The mask was gone, but its influence would never truly fade. It had left its mark on her soul, a stain that could never be washed away. And as she lay there, alone in the quiet of her apartment, she knew that the true horror of what she had experienced would stay with her forever. The mask had been destroyed, but the terror it had wrought was eternal, and Sarah was left to live with the knowledge that she had faced the abyss, and that a part of her had been lost to it forever. Sarah had survived the ritual, but the victory was hollow. The mask was gone, shattered into countless pieces, but the darkness it had brought into her life lingered like a poison in her veins. The apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a tomb, silent, oppressive, and filled with the echoes of the horrors she had endured. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. And Sarah, lying on the cold, hard floor, couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. that the mask's influence had not been fully vanquished. The days were a blur of fear and like confusion around. Sarah tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but everything felt wrong, distorted, as if the world had shifted subtly out of alignment. Objects in her apartment seemed to move when she wasn't looking, their positions just slightly off from where she remembered them. The light filtering through the windows had a strange, unnatural quality, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to writhe and flicker at the edges of her vision. And at night, the darkness felt thicker, more suffocating, filled with a presence she couldn't quite name but that she knew was watching her. The mask was gone, but its memory haunted her. She saw it everywhere, in the patterns of the wallpaper, in the swirling grain of the wooden floors, in the reflections of the windows at dusk. Its hollow eyes stared back at her from every reflective surface, taunting her with the knowledge that despite her best efforts, she could never truly escape it. The terror that had gripped her during the ritual had not faded. It had only changed, deepened, becoming a part of her, a shadow that clung to her every thought and action. Sleep offered no respite. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, more vivid and terrifying than ever before. She dreamed of the masked figure, its skeletal hand reaching for her, its eyes glowing with a cold, merciless light. In her dreams, she was always running, but no matter how fast she fled, the figure was always there, just behind her, its presence an unbearable weight that pressed down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. She would wake up gasping for air, her heart racing, drenched in sweat, but the fear didn't leave her. It stayed with her, a constant gnawing dread that made every moment of her waking life feel like a continuation of the nightmare. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's isolation deepened. She stopped going outside, too afraid of the world beyond her apartment's walls. The streets outside seemed foreign, hostile, filled with faceless figures that she couldn't trust. Her friends' voices on the phone sounded distant, their concern like a distant echo of a life she no longer recognized. The world had become a maze of shadows and whispers, and Sarah felt like she was the only real thing left, trapped in a reality that was slowly unraveling around her. The paranoia that had taken root in her mind during the mask's reign had now blossomed into full-blown terror. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains was a potential threat, a sign that the mask's influence had not been truly banished. She started to see things, fleeting shadows that darted across her peripheral vision, faces peering out from behind doors that were never fully closed. The walls seemed to close in on her, the ceiling pressing down, as if the apartment itself was conspiring to crush her under its weight. One night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she heard it again, the faint, rhythmic tapping that had haunted her before the ritual. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but as she strained to listen, it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from all around her, as if the apartment itself was alive, pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. The tapping grew louder, turning into a pounding that reverberated through her skull, making her head throb with pain. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and she felt a cold, clammy hand brush against her face. She bolted upright, her heart pounding, but the room was empty. The tapping had stopped, the air was still, but the sense of dread remained, thicker than ever. She could feel the darkness pressing in on her, suffocating her, as if the walls were closing in, inch by inch. The fear that had gripped her during the ritual returned with full force, but this time, there was no mask to blame, no entity to confront. The darkness was inside her now, a part of her, and there was no escaping it. The next morning, Sarah decided she couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The fear, the paranoia, the suffocating sense of dread, it was all too much. She needed to get out, to escape the oppressive atmosphere that had taken over her life. She packed a bag with trembling hands, not even sure where she would go, only that she had to leave. But as she reached for the door, she felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The room around her seemed to warp and twist, the walls bending at impossible angles as the shadows deepened, swallowing the light. She could feel the darkness seeping into her skin, crawling through her veins, filling her lungs with a cold, acrid smoke that made her choke and gag. The tapping started again, louder this time, more frantic, as if something was trying to break through the walls, to get to her. And then she heard the voices. They were faint at first, a distant murmur that she couldn't quite make out. But as the pain in her chest intensified, the voices grew louder, clearer, until they filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts. They were whispering her name over and over, in a tone that was both mocking and filled with a terrible sadness. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard, and she clutched her head, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voices were inside her now, a part of the darkness that had taken root in her soul. The room spun around her, and she felt herself being pulled down into the abyss that had opened up beneath her. The floor crumbled away, revealing a yawning void that seemed to stretch on forever. Filled with swirling shadows and flickering lights, the voices grew louder, more frantic, and she could feel the cold, clammy hands pulling at her, dragging her down into the darkness. She screamed, but no sound came out. The darkness closed in around her, swallowing her whole. And the last thing she saw before the void consumed her completely was the mask, its hollow eyes staring back at her from the abyss, filled with a cold, malevolent triumph. When Sarah awoke, she was lying on the floor of her apartment, the room bathed in the soft gray light of dawn. The mask was gone, the darkness had receded, but the fear, the terror, remained. The voices were silent, but their echoes lingered in her mind, a constant reminder of the nightmare she had endured. She was free, but at what cost? The darkness had left its mark on her, a stain that could never be washed away. And as she lay there, staring up at the ceiling, she knew that the true horror of what she had experienced was only beginning. The mask was gone, but the darkness it had brought into her life was eternal. It had taken everything from her sanity, her peace of mind, her very sense of self. And while she had survived, she was forever changed. The shadows in her apartment seemed to shift and flicker, as if alive, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding, a constant reminder that the terror she had faced was not truly over. Sarah knew that she would never be free. The darkness was a part of her now, a shadow that would follow her for the rest of her days. The mask had been destroyed, but its influence would never truly fade. It had left its mark on her soul, a scar that would never heal. And as she lay there, alone in the quiet of her apartment, she knew that the abyss that had opened up beneath her was still there, waiting, always waiting, for the moment when she would fall into it once more. The mask was gone, but the terror it had wrought was eternal, and Sarah was left to live with the knowledge that she had faced the abyss, and that a part of her had been lost to it forever. The darkness was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when it would claim her again, and she knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before it did. The ritual had ended, the mask was gone, but the nightmare that had consumed Sarah's life lingered like a shadow that refused to lift. Weeks had passed since that fateful night, and while the tangible horrors seemed to have faded, an unsettling tension remained, hanging in the air like a storm that had yet to break. Her apartment, once a place of refuge, now felt like a liminal space, a place caught between worlds, where the boundaries of reality were thin, fragile, and prone to tearing. There was a sense of quiet, an unnatural stillness that filled each room, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sarah had tried to resume her life, to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the cracks in her reality were too deep, too wide. The fear that had gripped her during the mask's reign had not disappeared. It had merely changed, becoming something subtler, more insidious. The darkness that had once been external was now internal, a part of her that she could not escape. She could feel it lurking in the corners of her mind, a constant presence that whispered doubts and fears into her thoughts. undermining her every attempt to rebuild her life. The world outside her apartment felt distant, unreal. She ventured out only when necessary, but the streets, once familiar, now seemed alien, filled with people who moved like shadows, their faces blurred and indistinct. The city itself seemed to have shifted, its atmosphere heavy with an oppressive sense of dread. The buildings loomed taller, the streets stretched longer, and the sky was perpetually overcast, as if the sun itself had been swallowed by the darkness that had taken root in her soul. Even the air felt different, thicker, as if she was breathing in the remnants of the nightmare that had consumed her. At night, the nightmares returned. They were different now, less vivid but more disturbing, filled with a sense of unease that lingered long after she woke. In these dreams, she was always alone, wandering through a world that was both familiar and strange, a twisted reflection of reality where the rules of time and space no longer applied. She would find herself in places she recognized, but they were wrong, distorted as if viewed through a funhouse mirror. The shadows were deeper, the light dimmer, and the air was filled with a low, droning hum that set her teeth on edge. The masked figure was still there, lurking at the edges of her vision, always just out of reach. It no longer chased her, but its presence was a constant, a reminder that the darkness was never far behind. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of it in a reflection, a flash of movement in a mirror, a shadow passing behind her in a window. But when she turned to look, it was always gone. The fear that gripped her in these moments was paralyzing, a cold, suffocating dread that made her heart race and her breath catch in her throat. But the most disturbing part of these dreams was the sense of familiarity that accompanied them. It was as if she had been to these places before, had walked these twisted streets, and entered these darkened buildings. The dreams felt less like figments of her imagination and more like memories, fragments of a life she didn't remember living. There was a sense of inevitability to them, a feeling that she was being drawn back to something, pulled towards an ending that she couldn't escape. During the day, the line between dream and reality continued to blur. She would find herself drifting off into a trance, her mind slipping into a fog where the world around her lost its solidity. She would lose track of time, hours passing in the blink of an eye, leaving her disoriented and confused. Sometimes she would wake up in a different room, with no memory of how she got there, her heart pounding and her hands trembling. The fear that had once been confined to the night now bled into her waking life, turning every moment into a waking nightmare. The apartment itself seemed to shift in subtle, unsettling ways. Doors that she knew she had closed would be open, objects would be out of place, and sometimes she would hear faint sounds, footsteps, the creak of a floorboard, the soft rustle of fabric, coming from rooms she knew were empty. She would often find herself standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, trying to convince herself that it was truly her staring back. But the eyes that met her gaze were unfamiliar, filled with a darkness that she couldn't quite comprehend. It was as if the mask had left an imprint on her soul, a mark that could never be erased. One evening, as she was sitting in the living room, the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The faint outline of a symbol drawn in chalk on the wall opposite her. It was one of the symbols from the ritual, half erased but still visible, a reminder of the nightmare she had tried to leave behind. Her heart raced as she stood up, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch it. The chalk was still fresh, as if it had been drawn only moments before. A cold dread settled over her as she realized that she wasn't alone. The apartment, which had seemed so empty and quiet, now felt alive, filled with a presence that was both familiar and terrifying. The shadows on the walls seemed to move of their own accord, twisting and writhing like living things. The air grew thick with an oppressive sense of dread, and she could feel the darkness closing in around her, suffocating her, pulling her back into the abyss. The tapping started again, that faint rhythmic sound that had haunted her before. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the very air around her, growing louder with each passing second. Her breath quickened, panic rising in her chest as the tapping turned into a pounding reverberating through the apartment, through her very bones. The shadows deepened, and she could see them now, figures moving in the darkness, their forms indistinct but undeniably real. The whispers began, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder, more insistent. They were speaking her name, over and over, in a tone that was both mocking and filled with a terrible, aching sadness. The fear that gripped her was unlike anything she had ever felt. A cold, suffocating terror that made her want to scream, to run. But she was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think. The darkness closed in around her, and she could feel the presence of the masked figure looming over her, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. In that moment, Sarah realized the truth. She had never truly escaped. The ritual, the destruction of the mask, it had all been a lie, a trick, a way to lure her into a false sense of security. The darkness had never left her. It had merely bided its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, it was claiming her, pulling her back into the nightmare from which there was no escape. The shadows surged forward, swallowing the room in darkness, and Sarah could feel herself being pulled down into the abyss that had opened up beneath her. The voices grew louder, more frantic, and she could feel the cold, clammy hands dragging her into the void. She screamed, but no sound came out, her voice lost in the darkness. The last thing she saw before the shadows consumed her completely was the mask, its hollow eyes staring back at her from the darkness, filled with a cold, malevolent triumph. And then, there was nothing. Sarah woke with a start, gasping for breath, her heart racing. The room was quiet, the air still, and the first light of dawn was filtering through the curtains. She was lying in her bed, drenched in sweat, her hands clutching the sheets. The fear that had gripped her only moments before was still there, a cold, suffocating dread that made it hard to breathe. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but everything seemed normal, calm. The symbols were gone, the shadows were just shadows, and the tapping had ceased. But the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of her mind, whispering that it wasn't over, that it would never be over. The mask was gone, but its influence lingered, a shadow that would follow her for the rest of her life. She had faced the abyss, but a part of her had been lost to it, swallowed by the darkness that had taken root in her soul. The day passed in a haze, and Sarah found herself going through the motions, trying to convince herself that it had all been a dream, a figment of her imagination. But as night fell, the fear returned, stronger than before. The apartment felt different, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of her vision, and the air was thick with an oppressive sense of dread. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, could hear the faint echoes of the voices in the distance. As she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to fall asleep. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, to move closer, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. The fear that gripped her was paralyzing, a cold, suffocating terror that made her want to scream, to run. But she knew there was nowhere to go. The darkness was inside her now, a part of her, and there was no escaping it.